Now let's talk about an effect that happens when we use a microphone. As we discussed that low frequencies have more energy than high frequencies, it stands to reason when you get closer to a microphone, you get the proximity of the sound source gets closer to the microphone, it picks up more low frequencies. This is one of the principles that Frank Sinatra used to use all the time. He'd croon into the microphone and hold it really close, and his voice would get richer and thicker, more like a baritone saxophone. That's called the proximity effect. And you have to be aware of that when you're recording a vocalist. Let's say you're the singer or you're recording a singer and you set up your microphone and they start getting real close to the mic. Not only is it going to get louder because they're getting more energy into the microphone, but also it's going to get more bassy, more bottom end frequencies. That's another really good reason to use a pop filter. It keeps a harness on the vocalist so that they know that they can't get too close or too far away from the microphone. That's the proximity effect. And actually, I utilize that a lot when I record bass guitars. I'll put the microphone really close to the sound source to get a little more bottom out of it. The other interesting thing that happens, though, is if you get too far away, then you start losing high end as well. So the frequency response changes the further away from the microphone you are. The other thing that I do quite often, instead of using a pop filter to really protect from bursts of air, because the pop filter is fairly inefficient. I've had a lot of vocalists be able to pop my mic even with a pop filter. But what I tend to do is, and this is sort of a little trick that not everybody does, but instead of having the microphone in this sort of perpendicular kind of fashion where the sound energy hits the capsule directly on, I'll angle the mic just slightly, usually about 15 degrees. And if I do that, then the sound isn't going directly into the capsule where the sound energy doesn't hit the capsule flat on. And what it tends to do is with this angle, it tends to eliminate a little bit of the excess high frequency. There's another problem with vocalists that happens. It's called sibilance. And when I'm speaking, you can't really hear it, so I'll exaggerate it. It's like when the S's overtake the vocal ist, and all you hear are the S's. Instead of trying to EQ that out or use a compressor to compress those frequencies, if you position the microphone properly, you can pretty much eliminate excess high frequencies. Now, we're usually talking about a vocalist singing, but let's talk about somebody speaking and narrating. Say you're recording somebody doing a book on tape. The best way to do it is not to have the microphone in the same position as you'd have a vocalist, but to have this kind of an angle on the microphone, because if you don't, all you'll hear from the speaker is all sorts of lip smacks and cracks and noises you don't normally hear unless you put your ear right next to somebody's mouth as they're speaking. You wouldn't realize how much distraction that is when you're trying to hear somebody narrate a book. The other thing that works really well is that you angle it so the vocalist speaks past the microphone and not into it. So if I have a microphone here, the singer is going to sing right into it. If I move it off to the side slightly and the speaker speaks past the microphone, then you miss all the air bursts, you miss all the excess sibilance, and you actually get a speaker to sound really good as you'd hear on a book on tape or a narration. So there's a lot of nuances as to mic positioning and what type of mic you use and so on. So that's the proximity effect that we just discussed. Let's talk about some miking techniques, how to use microphones. Start with stereo miking. Stereo miking is when you're using more than one microphone. You're using two microphones to capture something in stereo. Let's just talk about what you'd like to capture in stereo, because that's kind of important as to when to use a stereo miking technique. If I'm recording a piano, I usually record it in stereo, even though I must admit when I'm lazy I do it in mono and it turns out great too. In fact, all of the early rock records, most pianos were recorded in mono. What else would you record in stereo? My pat answer that I always use is I'd record things in stereo that are generally too big to record in mono. For example, a string quartet, too big to record in mono. Well, you could record them in mono, but since there's so many sound elements, or an orchestra, or say a choir, right? Those things are large, and having the stereo imaging really matters to how they sound. So the stereo miking techniques, would I record, say, an electric guitar in stereo? Probably not. Would I record a kick drum in stereo? Certainly not. Would I record a saxophone in stereo? Or a vocalist? No, probably not. That would all be in mono. You can combine mono and stereo techniques in different kinds of situations. For example, a drum kit, I would use stereo and mono techniques. So first let's talk about stereo techniques, and let's take as an example, say a choir. They're on a stage and they're maybe 20, 30 feet across the stage. A coincident or XY is one of the most typically used types of miking techniques. What it is two microphones at right angles or in an XY system, and they're cardioid microphones. Let me just give you this example, okay? So we've got our choir standing on the stage. And if we're going to use an XY pattern to record this in stereo, and all of a sudden you've got a left and a right image, but you've got a single point source. The capsules are in the same physical location. So that stands to reason that between the two mics, there's not going to be any phasing from sound taking time to travel. So if there's a vocalist closer to the pair and a vocalist further from the pair, it all arrives at both microphones at the same time. So it's all phase consistent. Second technique that we can use is called the Blumen type technique. So this is an XY technique, except now we're using figure 8 microphones in terms of their polar patterns. So instead of just picking up left and right, they're also picking up back here and back here if you wanted to pick up audience response, if the audience is sitting here. So that's a cute method of working, and some people really like those kinds of things, but I don't adhere to that kind of technique much. There's a lot of really cool techniques that people have worked out to try to use for symphonies and for high fidelity recordings where you've only got a couple microphones. But in general, when I'm working on music, I'm using a choir or a symphony as an additional sound element, and my best way of recording it is as a XY pair. There's another technique called a split pair technique, which is where you put a microphone on one side of the stage and a microphone on the other side. So now you've got a left and a right, and these are also cardioid, and they're picking up the left and the right side of the stage. So that seems to work really well because you really get a stereo image. But as we discussed before, if you've got two sound sources that are in separate positions, the time it takes for the sound to get from one microphone may be different as it takes to get to the other microphone of the same sound source, or the same vocalist, or the same string player, whatever, if this was a symphony. And so what ends up happening is you end up getting phasing between the two mics. Now the beauty of it is that in certain situations, phasing can be a good sound. If I'm recording a choir or I'm recording a symphony, the sound of the choir and the sound of the symphony has to do with phasing. It's supposed to phase to make it sound like what it's supposed to sound like. For example, if I've got a big string section and I've got 8 violins, they're all going to be in different places and they're going to phase no matter where I stand. And that's actually part of the sound, that they don't play perfectly together at all times. Maybe the pitch shifts a little bit between violinists. Their timing isn't exactly 100% perfect, and that's what creates the sound of bigness. So the phasing part is also a very important element to capturing these kinds of choirs or symphonies or large gatherings of musicians. So if I was to truly record a choir, for example, I recorded the choir on Like a Prayer. How did we mic that choir? It was Andre Crouch. It was 16 males, 16 females, 32 vocalists. And they were sort of on risers. It's an XY in the middle to capture the entire picture in stereo. Then I used a split pair to reinforce that. And then I actually used one mono microphone in each section where the sopranos were, the basses were, the tenors, so that way I could have a little more control over the blend of the sopranos versus the altos versus the tenors and so on. So using all of those techniques, then I could get a really good sound. But in general, use mostly the XY to capture the overall sound and use the others as augmentation microphones. There's another type of mic technique that works fairly well. Let me go to my next card. This is a kind of configuration that's it's a near coincident microphone pattern where it's basically like they've got some very fancy types of ways of miking up symphonies and large gatherings. And one of them is, in this card, there's another one that I'll describe that's called a deca tree. and it's like a tree pretty much. The whole system is a microphone here, 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 sort of like a Christmas tree, except the microphones are all at different angles, and they all have to be precise angles. They have to be specifically certain distances from each other. It's a technique that's really fun to read about, but I'd never use it. Theoretically, really supposed to sound good. Spaced pair technique, if you want to take a look at this, it sort of explains how you can get phasing. So if you think about it, here's a great example. You think about going to a live performance and you look at the drums and how they're mic'd up. And usually there's one over the left side of the drums, one over the right side. In a live situation, that works fine for me. It's not as precise as in a studio because you've got other sound elements on stage and it's supposed to capture the left and the right, and it's not necessarily supposed to be super hi-fi. On the other hand, in the studio, over the drums, I would use an XY pattern because then you get phase consistency, you don't have excess phasing. In the studio, everything is more like under a microscope. You can hear everything more precisely than in a live situation. Even though I must admit I know a lot of engineers that have great credentials that use a split pair over the drums. And I would absolutely never do that. I was never taught to do that. But there's no right or wrong. And so the fact is, it's an artistic form, and you can try whatever you like. My biggest problem with miking up a drum kit when I first did my first drum kit is I had phasing between all the mics, and everything sounded really undefined. So creating phasing is a problem when you're trying to mic up something like a drum kit.